Welcome to Working with Watercolors Digitally. Today I'm going to be working in Procreate. A lot of the techniques I'm going to be covering are specific to Procreate, but you can spread them to other raster-based programs, whether using Photoshop or any other watercolor brush in other programs. If you've watercolored before on paper, when you move to the digital world, it gets a little trickier. That's because watercolor paint is, and this is going to sound obvious, it's wet, whereas this is dry. When I lay down wet watercolor on dry paper, it gives me this nice clean surface. Sometimes you'll get crisp edges, and I could do pretty much the same thing right here in Procreate if I come in with my brush. But if I let go, if I remove my brush here in Procreate and lay down more ink, I get a very dark color overlapping on top of it. That's because as soon as I pick up my brush, it thinks that the paper is dry. In real life, if you let your paint dry and then you put more paint on, you will get a similar effect. But if it's still wet and you add paint, it's just going to kind of bleed into the paint that's already there. That's part of the art of watercoloring, when to paint dry and when to paint wet. And oftentimes, adding a little more paint along the sides, you don't get what you want because you're adding up more paint over and over again. So something that I often do a lot is that I grab my watercolor brushes and I actually use them not so much as brushes here, but I use the brushes in smudge mode. You can smudge with any brush that you want. So I'll open up my watercolor brushes, and here I'll find something with a texture, and I just have to find something that works, maybe a wet shader or something like that. And then I come in here and I smudge, and it helps me spread that paint as if the inside of the circle was wet. In fact, that is another technique. This, obviously, most of these brushes will form a hard edge like real watercolor will, but oftentimes I'll come in here with my blender and I'll just rough up that edge. It's like adding water to it. The other thing you get in watercolor is if you're on a wet surface and you have one color and you add a second color, you can get some interesting gradients going on. And again, that is very hard to do here. Like if I grab a really bright red and I lay it down, I guess I could smudge this in here and that kind of works. But something I like to do with watercolor digitally that works pretty well is I'll come in here, I'll go to my layer, I'll tap on it, and I'll turn on alpha lock. And what that means is wherever I paint, that is where, or I should say wherever there is paint, that's where more paint will go as I continue to add to it. So if I add to here, so if I wanted to do a different kind of gradient here, one thing I could do is I could go to my layers, I could tap on it, and I can alpha lock. What does alpha lock do? It means that I'm only going to put paint where there already is paint. Okay, let me show you what that means. Some of you probably already know. But let me use one of my inking brushes. I have a totally different color, and if I scribble over here, there's no paint. My paint doesn't show up. But as soon as I go into the area where I've already laid down paint, that's where my color goes, and that's how I lay down a lot of my gradients. And I'll use something like an airbrush. Now, these airbrushes are native to Procreate. You don't have to download anything extra here. So let me turn this down to a darker shade of red, and I can come in here with my airbrush. I can adjust my size, make it bigger, smaller. Let's go to a medium size, and I'll come in from the side, and I'll start to add some red. And as I apply more pressure, it applies more paint. And I could get some really nice gradients going there. Like I could go up here, and I could grab an orange, and we can kind of fade it in. And we can get some really neat effects by doing it that way. But when you want to create something that looks like watercolor, oftentimes you have to move away from traditional ways of painting on watercolor. Another thing that I have going on here might be kind of hard to see. I'm going to zoom in. Hopefully it's easier to see. Might be hard to see on the camera, but there is a texture here. So there's other things included in this package beyond just your brushes. There's this paper texture that's just a JPEG that you can add to the back. There's also all sorts of other brushes. For example, we have some watercolor washes. Actually, I'm going to show these to you in a minute because there's one more thing I want to talk about. And then I'm going to show you some cool things we could do with the washes and splatters and those sorts of textures. So what I have here is a drawing of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and I'm gonna watercolor some stuff in here. So let me grab like a nice shade of blue for the background. Let me go to my brushes and find a nice, wet, maybe this one will work. So I'm gonna turn up the size of that and get a nice wash going. Maybe I'll make it even bigger, and I'll press very lightly to get my wash going, and then I'll apply more pressure to kind of darken it up, maybe come in for a second second swipe in there. Now, obviously, I don't want my sandwich to be blue, and I have a really rough, wet edge here, and that's fine. So what I might do is I might just come in here with my eraser and just kind of ditch this extra blue. And if I want to, I can come in and be a little bit more careful with it and kind of take out some of these edges. That's something I often do a lot with these watercolor brushes, is I'll combine digital tips and tricks along with the kind of standard watercolors that we're used to. So there we go. That's nice and erased out. Another technique that I use is oftentimes these watercolor brushes give me a nice texture, but I don't want the wet edge, or the edge might be a touch too sloppy for me. So another thing that I like to do is I'll just take my pen tool, just my standard inking tools that I like to play with. These are some of my free brushes, the Tech Pen and the Tech Pen Wiggly over here, and I'll just come in here and I will like draw in an area like the crust of this bread. Now once that's drawn in, I want to fill it with white paint, and then I'm going to paint on top of that white paint. So I'll come in here, I'll tap on it, I'll alpha lock it. Now I want to fill it with white paint. So let me grab color white here, and then we'll come back here and I will say fill layer. Now that's filled with white. There's a couple things we could do with masks and stuff here, but for now I'm going to just keep it simple, and we'll just paint on the white. Since it's locked in, yep, that's like it was before. Alpha lock is on, which means anywhere I paint will only show up where there's already paint. So we can come in here, grab a nice watercolor brush. We can even use the same one we've been using up to this point. I can grab a color that will look good for the crust, maybe a darker brownish color. And I can come in here, and that brown is only going to show up where I want it to show up, right there on the crust. Another cool technique that you're going to see in my videos a lot of times are just adding textures, and this includes a lot of textures. So we have the brushes, which we've been playing with, but we also have washes. Let me make some nice washes here. I got my own layer, and so if I just tap anywhere, you can see it adds a wash. Maybe put some over here. There's different textures, because if you reuse the same texture, people are going to notice. Let me undo that then. And so what I can do is I can start grabbing extra textures. Okay, maybe put some of that there. This one looks kind of cool. Let's stick that there. Give me something like this. Maybe that goes up there. And so now we're getting some good textures going on here. Now, of course, black watercolor texture doesn't look good. Kind of hides our drawing a little bit. So what we're going to do to this layer is we're going to tap on the letter N, and then we're going to change our modes here. So I'm going to go to contrast and choose overlay, and that affects the way kind of the light goes through that layer. So right now you can see it's probably too dark for that character. So maybe what I want to do is tap and hold on that layer, drag it all the way down. So now it's right above that background. Now, normally I would tone it down a bit, but you probably wouldn't be able to see a lot of that on the camera here. But you get the idea. You can add a lot of different personality to this. I could add some drips and things like that. There's a lot of splatters in here if I want to add some splatters behind my character, you know, that sort of thing to this. You can add a lot of organic watercolor effects to your drawings, giving them some more personality.